You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, and Tony is with me, and we are here to cover the week of January 6th through the 12th. We have a little bit of different things. Our topics of discussion this time around is we've got more sports news. Not a surprise there because sports continues to be a major draw for the future of streaming. We also have a couple service updates, and we have, as our main topic, we're going to be talking about movies in 2020 and movies in 2021, and specifically talking about the success and how the success of last year when it comes to movies and streaming can translate into success for 2021, and kind of recapping some of the stuff that's already been announced that's happening for 2021 and the fallout from that. So with that being said, let's get into sports first. So there's a couple of different things. First one being that ESPN Plus has started to line up some new studio shows for their service. This is them expanding their original content. They already obviously have some content that's exclusive to ESPN Plus, but now they are specifically targeting their studio shows as they're targeting certain studio shows to either develop new shows for the service or bringing existing hosts of existing shows over to Disney Plus as exclusives so that they can get more exclusive content for the service itself.
This is, I think, pretty interesting. So we hear a lot about how streaming services need to invest in sports, and that's usually gone into acquiring, the licensing rights, the streaming rights to these different leagues that happen, to the different games, and then just displaying those on their services. I mean, we've seen that with Amazon, Peacock, CBS All Access, and a few others. Like, that's kind of been the normal playbook. And ESPN Plus, I felt, launched just because it was part of the bundle. It was already a thing, but then it got a lot of surge with being a part of the bundle, the Disney Plus bundle with Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus. But I think the sentiment around ESPN Plus was that there was a lot of letdown there because there wasn't that much content. And so, yeah, you had the UFC that was on there and pay-per-view and a few other things. But I think ESPN Plus as a streaming service has been, significantly lacking in content. And if you can't get sports rights, the bidding on the licensing rights to these different games that happen, because those are extremely expensive, what you can do is, utilize a playbook that they're already implementing now. Sports like opinion shows, talk shows have a pretty huge audience. First Take, that's on ESPN, they very much pay attention to the ratings, and it's been a thing of the past, I think, the decade. There's been some changes there in how to get back on top because Fox's sports show cut a lot into the revenue. But the point is like, these opinion shows are very huge, and creating this type of content, I mean, you just have some people in the room just talking about sports. You already have a pretty involved fan base into these sports shows. I think it's very interesting. This is a very different move that we've seen in the sports side of the streaming service, and I think that there's a lot of potential here because you're taking pundits and spectators and commentators, takes, and you're trying to package it up. I mean, Stephen A. Smith is very huge in the space of talk shows. He also hosts First Take, and so he's definitely going to draw an audience as well. So overall, this is a pretty awesome move by ESPN Plus. And Fox, maybe they can do something there because they have big sports show, and maybe partnering or doing whatever they need to get that out there and get other sports related content as well. I mean, you could see CBS doing that because they have CBS Sports, and they could do something there with that. So there's a lot of room to kind of delve into this idea of these new studio shows. But overall, this is really cool.
One thing that has popped up actually in the past related to this kind of exact content was when Peacock launched. Shortly after Peacock launched, I believe it was back in August and September, there was a number of shows that were currently on NBC Sports that were daily shows that were popping up that they exclusively moved over to Peacock. And I think the reason why is because if they have a following in general, they can bring that content over to the service. And ESPN is doing this very similar situation by bringing some of their existing hosts over to a show to a new show and allowing it to be exclusive to the service. It's the one way you can get people who are already watching your product to look at your higher tiered, the best way to put it, the higher tier offering that you are offering your customers. So I think this is really smart. Some other sports news. It was also announced that Supercross and Pro Motocross are moving from NBC Sports over to Peacock Premium tier in 2021. That's going to bring a lot more sports content to Peacock. Obviously, as we've talked about the last couple episodes, Peacock is going all in on bringing some of the other non-major sports leagues into what they have for Peacock. NBC Sports has a lot of content. When NBC Universal and Comcast kind of combined their resources, when Comcast bought out NBC Universal, there was obviously Comcast Sportsnet, which was a lot of regional channels, and those regional channels opened up the door to create a lot more area for NBC Sports because they didn't previously have that, and now everything's been rebranded to NBC Sports, and there's still regional content. But the interesting thing about this is that a lot of that content that was previously on NBC Sports is now going to be making its way over to Peacock.
I mean, once again, we see these services diving into the niche sports. Yes, they might not have a huge amount of following, but you see the big dogs, attacking the NCAA, NFL, Premier League, Champions League, like these big sports leagues, MLB as well. These master sports leagues, and paying huge costs to license that content and put it on their streaming service, versus you can just target one of these niche sports, pay a lot less, but still they have a pretty ardent following with just the number that they have. The amount of followers is much less, but they're very dedicated, and so you can still make a profit on these sports. So if you get a couple of these niche sports, over time you can build to have a pretty impressive block of sports watchers there that can be very useful. So I can't remember where I read it, but they're talking about how ESPN is definitely moving into the space and how much that they see the potential for growing their margins every single year. And we're seeing NBC Sports, which I did not realize how many different sports that they're the NBC on Peacock. Sorry, but NBC Sports carries a lot of different niche sports. I mean, I think they talked about in that same article how rugby was on their service starting in last November or last October, late October. So this is pretty huge. This is cool to see. Once again, niche sports, they appeal to people, and so getting more adoption, getting more eyes on them is definitely important. But this is a very good thing for streaming services as well. We keep talking about sports is one of the big, final frontiers left in streaming. Besides getting these TV shows, getting huge movies. With Hamilton, you're seeing more Broadway type content coming on streaming service. And sports is definitely kind of the last big frontier left for these streaming services to really go after.
Agreed. And one of the things that we brought up on the last episode was talking about how we were specifically talking about Formula One and Prime Video, and how races in general is one of those things where people can go back and they can watch it when it's not on. And interestingly, there was a little bit of a news piece that came out stating that all Premier League matches will now be available on demand on Peacock, which means even if the game doesn't actually air on Peacock, it will actually be able to be seen on demand. And that means you can catch up on some of those matches. Obviously, that's a big deal because Peacock is obviously here locally in the United States. Premier matches are not taking place here in the United States. They're taking place in Europe in a different time zone. So being able to watch those games or those matches on demand is a big deal. And I think that it's smart for this to happen. And I can only imagine that we're going to start to see more on-demand options come to other sports games and matches and things like that in the near future, just because it makes sense, especially when they're bringing in sports from outside of the country. All right, jumping over to some service updates. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about. The first one is Roku has announced their numbers for the end of 2020, and they have landed over 51 million active users over the course of over the latest quarter. And this is really interesting because when you compare the numbers at the end of 2019, they were sitting at about 36.9. So they've almost made up 15 million active users in just 1 year. Now, obviously, the global pandemic is going to add its own bunch of users because people in general are staying home more frequently, but that is a significant jump up and shows just how important these devices are to the streaming, to the streaming services in general. It also shows, because just to tie it back, because I love Google TV, how important it was for Google TV to really get a device that can at least offer some of the same advantages of having a Roku or having an Amazon Fire. There's no reason, if you have the ability to put out a device and you have the money to do it, why not have a device out there to at least compete? Because there is such a large market for these, and it only continues to grow. And 2020 alone has grown this market, this industry, so much more than I think anybody would have anticipated at the end of 2019.
Yes, Roku, I mean, these numbers are just huge. And it just shows how important Roku is. You know, they are the gatekeeper into streaming on, for most households and on most devices. And it's just phenomenal to see their growth and just how, if you could look at their competition, especially with like Apple, and how they usually have this prestige of doing something really great. And I feel like Apple TV was one of the first competitors. With Apple TV was kind of leading the space, and then Roku was the upstart. Roku's overtaken them. Roku's got, they innovate faster in their boxes. I feel like the hardware is better, and it's just markedly cheaper, easier to use. And so, and now you're seeing more competitors in this space, like Google TV, and Amazon Fire, and probably a few others that are very, less important. And so it just shows how it shows the reach that Roku and these other streaming devices have, and how important it is for streaming services to make deals with, Roku, Google TV, Apple TV. It's huge. And evidently, Dustin, their individual channel, their Roku channel, was seen by like over 61 million people.
Yes.
That's, once again, that doesn't necessarily entail like active users and amount of content watched. Like, there's a lot of things not there, but that Roku channel, that's pretty surprising. I was kind of confused where they wanted to go with that, because it just seems like a hodgepodge collection of just random stuff that no one really cared to try to license on their streaming service. But I've been checking it out recently, and they have some pretty like big name content. One of the biggest ones I've seen recently was Inception is now on the Roku channel. It flashed by real quick. I doubt it's going to stay there for forever, but they have some pretty big names, and that's pretty cool. I wonder what they're going to try to do with the Roku channel, if they're really going to try to grow that part of their business more, or they're just going to keep, or they're just going to kind of keep it as it is. It's just a supplementary product, but really focus on the hardware part.
The things that I've heard about the Roku channel, outside of obviously what we talked about last episode with Quibi, because that did actually get officially announced. Roku did license Quibi's library of content, and it will be popping up on the Roku channel. They don't own it. They're just licensing it, and they are, in fact, using the content that is not some of the daily news shows that obviously would be outdated at this point. But they still get somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 originals that can air on the Roku channel. What's interesting to me about the Roku channel is my understanding of it has always been it's a grab for advertisements. It's a way for Roku to have their own content that they license, not their own content, but content that they license. They're paying money for it, but in turn have those advertisements, those advertisements there, offer the content for free. Years ago, when I first got a Roku, I remember seeing the Roku channel as I was downloading apps and thinking, I have no idea what this is. And I distinctly remember one of the shows that was on there was the Batman 1966 series with Adam West and Burt Ward. And I thought, that is so strange that this show is on here and not, on any of the other services out there. Maybe it's not as popular, but this is a show that also was in syndication for years and years and years. And there's been other ones too. Unsolved Mysteries, which just got rebooted over at Netflix. The old episodes were on Roku channel at the time too. Now, I don't know. That was also more than a couple of years ago, so things have obviously changed. But what it comes across to me is that Roku channel has content that is basically in limbo when it comes to licensing agreements. If there's a licensing agreement that ends on maybe the 15th, most of the agreements end on the end of the month or the beginning of the month. There's a small window that, like a company like Warner Media could license out Inception to the Roku channel for 15 days before they could bring it back to their own service, just because of how these agreements work. That's what it comes across as, because there is stuff that comes in and out of the Roku channel very frequently. That said, I think that they have no intention. I mean, the word out there is that they spent about $50 million to license the Quibi content. I don't know how they're going to get, if that's an actual true number, which by all accounts is better than some of the, is more realistic number compared to the other ones of $100 million. I don't know why they would have paid $100 million for the Quibi content, but the reality is that if they have content on there and that advertisement flow is actually as lucrative as they say, it's the same reason why Peacock has their service, right alongside the 24-hour streaming channels. They've got those advertisements that play. There is some sort of decent market when it comes to what money you can bring in from that stuff. And it has to be enough, because if they are paying for content elsewhere and they're licensing the content, even if it's content that nobody wants, they wouldn't be paying for it if people weren't actually using it. So it shows that even, and this is another interesting number, that 61 million says that's how many people were actually using the Roku channel, which means out of the 51 million devices that are out, or the active users that are using it, more people are actually watching the Roku channel than the active user count, which means that you could sit there and say, well, how's that possible? But the Roku channel is actually an app that you can download on your phones, and you can watch the Roku channel for free on your phones with the ads. So you don't even have to have a Roku in order to use that. And I think it's a marketing tool in some ways, because it shows, hey, we're not just a device, we also have content, but also at the same time, they can make some money off of those ads. So I don't see it going anywhere, but I don't really honestly see it becoming any more than it already is. So there's that. All right. So the other interesting service update was, there's a report out there that stemmed from The Information, which is a very reliable site when it comes to this kind of stuff, that HBO Max, we all questioned what obviously HBO Max and Amazon, they had their issues when it came to pulling out a deal. Roku had a similar issue, and a lot of it stemmed from HBO Max wanting their own data coming from their own app. They didn't want the channels. Roku and Amazon had HBO channels that you could add on to the service as part of just using the Roku or Amazon devices. And that data was then transferred basically to Amazon or Roku, and they could use that data to sell advertisements in general. And not necessarily for the premium channel, obviously, but just for the other aspects of their services. Well, one of the things that HBO Max wants is they want control of that data, because they have every intention of launching an ad-supported version of the app. And when they do, they want that data as much as possible. When it comes to Amazon Roku, there's too large of a number to not get that data. You can't sit there and say, okay, we've got our app available on this service, but we have absolutely zero data, so we can't actually use that as any information to sell to advertisers. So that was supposedly the main reason why HBO Max and Roku and Amazon were having issues, was basically Warner Media wanted their stuff to be off of a channel on Roku or on Amazon, and they wanted to have their own standalone app so that they could get the data themselves. That way they can also, among other things, control the user experience and the way things are presented and everything like that. But the main reason was the data for ads going forward. Now, we still don't know exactly what ended up making Roku make the deal, but outside of the fact that Wonder Woman was right around the corner, but HBO Max is the one that suffers in that situation, not necessarily Roku. However, the Amazon one, at the time, it was rumored that, well, maybe they licensed some content to IMDb TV, and because we've seen that in the past with content being licensed by Disney to IMDb TV with specifically Lost. Roku channel, obviously content can be licensed there. We've talked about that in the past about, well, maybe this is one of the things that can happen. But it turns out the rumor is that The reason why HBO Max was able to get a deal with Amazon was because Warner Media in general made a deal with Amazon Web Services to actually extend their contract so that they continue to use Amazon Web Services for the foreseeable future. And that raises some red flags.
I couldn't really... This is very surprising news. I mean, once again, I'm happy that the HBO Max deal happened because HBO Max is great content. People should watch it. It should be everywhere, right? I think that's pretty clear. What does concern me is that this deal, excluding maybe the issues with advertisements, issues with who's controlling the data, issues of who is in control of the user experience and how important that is into companies' profits moving forward on different apps. Excluding all that, this notion that Amazon forced Warner Media's hand in getting this deal done of, okay, like you can have this control, but you need to extend your contract with us even more. AWS is in control of, it's the biggest the biggest company in terms of that hosts web content, and that could be just different servers, websites, all the different types of stuff. Like a lot of traffic goes through AWS, especially more so than its competitors. I mean, Azure is a distant second, and then Google Cloud is a distant third. So AWS is the most dominant player. I mean, so take a side note. And Dustin, I think I brought this up with you a few times, but Amazon as a whole, yes, they are huge. You talk about the stock price, you talk about their valuation as a company, the market valuation. They are huge, but they don't generate that much profit given the size of their business, especially like the retail side. It's sometimes they make profit, sometimes they don't. It's very interesting in that part. But AWS, the web services side, consistently makes a profit, and it's actually been one of the biggest drives of why Amazon has reached its, the current zenith of how important it is, how wealthy it is as a company, because of the web services division just churning profit. And so I don't really like this deal because, okay, you're gonna, what if you essentially Amazon somehow is gonna manipulate Warner Media and essentially force them off Amazon AWS. I mean, you can go to Azure, you can go to Google Cloud, but it takes a long time to set up the infrastructure. There's not necessarily a one-to-one parity between the different services that Amazon has versus Microsoft or Google. And so you're kind of Amazon is making a threat that they can definitely do, and Warner Media can't just be like, okay, well, I'm going to go somewhere else, because that's effectively you can't really do that in a very short amount of time. To not get too crazy into political, but recently AWS kicked Parler, that social networking side, off of AWS, and forgetting everything else. That's a huge move because Parler is down until they can get their servers back up again, and who knows when that's going to be, because they're going to have to change different cloud platforms. So rounding it back, I just don't feel right about this deal. And Amazon's been accused of anti-competitive behavior. This deal kind of smells a little bit of that. Once again, we don't necessarily know the full details of this contract extension, but okay, hey, you need to extend your contract with AWS, or so that we can give you just this little bit of control on your app, or quote unquote threat, we might not renew your contract later on. And like the bigger the company that you are able to negotiate these cloud contracts with these, these big companies. The current company I work at, we have so much volume that the current rates, we're able to negotiate that price down. And so basically to kind of have that like favored status versus paying, you can almost view it as like paying wholesale versus like, going to the grocery store and then just buying it one-on-one at a time. It's a very good analogy, I guess, with these contracts that happen. And so either not renewing the contract in terms of like kicking Warner Media off, which is just a drastic move all in all, or you're not going to renew this contract or let it lapse or something like that. And then now Warner Media is going to have to pay, the current market price for their services, which is just a whole bunch of money. At the end of the day, Dustin, I don't know how you feel about it, but I do not like the details of this. It just seems, sketchy. It seems anti-competitive. And as much as Amazon's been in the news, especially in the United States, and definitely as much as in the EU for like these anti-competitive behaviors, if we see or if we hear more of these types of deals, you will definitely hear, I think, regulators start to put their nose into this part of the Amazon's business and really try to get to the truth there.
I agree. When a lot of times when they talk about the antitrust situations at the big tech companies, I tend not to give too much concern about it because it's not something that I'm generally concerned with. I mean, I do acknowledge that all of these companies have way more power and control over a lot of the aspects of our society than anybody would care to admit. However, I think that sometimes, especially when it comes to some of these companies, some of the things that they implement and they do, it warrants what the give and take. Like they're giving us something and they're taking it. It's not always the case, and they're always getting a lot more than we are. But I will say that it's not something I generally care. I'm generally concerned with. However, stuff like this kind of annoys me because this is, obviously HBO Max, they're looking at getting the data. They need to be successful long term in order to maintain their service. They can't succeed without having the data to potentially do their ad service or their ad supported service and then have a better experience for customers, offer the service to people who maybe aren't willing to pay $15 a month for it. That's the whole reason they need this data. The point of contention for Amazon is literally nothing. It's just that if they keep the Prime channel, they have control over the data, and that data isn't selling any advertisements on that channel anyway. So it doesn't do that much for Amazon to make it seem like a big deal. However, and then there's the other part of it. If you sign up for an Amazon Prime channel, through Amazon that is, and you're utilizing HBO or Starz or Showtime, Amazon gets a cut. However, if somebody signed up for HBO Max using an Amazon Fire device, they get the exact same cut. So they're not losing money like in the bounty situation when it comes to affiliates, when it comes to the services. So it just feels like it's such a trivial thing to get held up on for the sake of a customer who should be the main focus, when in reality it becomes, well, we already have the control, so now you must pay us an additional bounty in order to get some of that control back that we already had. And that's the part that I have a problem with. I think that some of these companies, they get a little too greedy. Obviously Amazon and Roku were accused of being extremely greedy when HBO Max wasn't originally on the service. From whatever side you want to look at it, both have something to gain from, their own perspective reasonings. But I think that when you look at the customer side of things, which is the part that matters to me, HBO Max was in a situation where they're trying to do something for the customer. Yes, it was obviously going to make them more money. It's obviously going to get more ad revenue when it comes to their ad-supported service down the line. It's obviously going to potentially allow them to reach more customers, which will in turn raise their money. But I think that it's still customer-driven. And I think that decisions when it comes to these tech things and the streaming services that are customer-driven, I think are way more important than some of the other aspects, which is, more business and investor related. I at heart am in customer, and that's what I care about primarily. So this just, I agree with you completely. Yeah. This just screams anti-competitive, and I don't like it.
Oh, you don't think about antitrust, anti-competitive law, just in your free time?
No, unfortunately, I don't have that much free time.
You're not missing much. I just want it to be known that, yes, HBO Max got what they wanted. Amazon got what they wanted, extending the AWS contract. Both sides got what they wanted. And even for HBO Max, for Warner Media, extending the AWS contract, forgetting the terms about it, it's actually a pretty good win for them because they use the services. They can get kind of this discounts that happen. You can, negotiate the rates on different products. It was a win overall for all companies, but just to be clear, just because it was a win for everyone involved, in the consumer at the end of the day, that finally that ever happened. There's something about Amazon and AWS kind of holding these companies hostage. So Warner Media uses Amazon AWS services. Netflix is one of the biggest users of AWS services. And so that just concerns me of the web hosting side of the business affecting maybe the streaming side of the business. And just because everything worked out in the end does not mean that there's still something, fishy going on in this deal.
All right. So with that being said, we're going to move into our final discussion, which has to do with movies. And if you are a movie lover, such as myself, you probably enjoyed a lot of movies over the course of 2020 when it came to streaming, because theaters just weren't a viable option for most of the year. So you probably might have watched Wonder Woman 1984. Maybe you checked out Extraction or The Old Guard on Netflix. Maybe you checked out some of the films that Prime Video offered. But all of the services in general are offering films. And as we progress into 2021, there's a lot of things that are changing when it comes to the film industry. One of the more specific things that we talked about last month was that Warner Brothers is releasing concurrently their films on HBO Max at the same time they're releasing in theaters because of COVID-19. In addition to that, we have other studios that are committed to the theatrical model, like Disney, that have had movies on the service. They moved Hamilton, which was originally a film that they intended on having in theaters, and they moved that to Disney Plus, and it did great for them. They got a lot of signups. Wonder Woman 1984, which was the first one of the films that HBO Max was releasing on the service, that film did extremely well to get them a lot of signups. Even Soul, which doesn't get as much talk about it because it obviously released right after The Mandalorian Season 2 released, so it didn't see as many signups, which is generally what you hear about when people talk about the success of a film, is how many people are signing up for the service right around that time that the film actually releases. But Soul even gave Disney Plus a little bit of a boost during the holiday season with signups. So the interesting thing is there's a couple of different articles we have in the show notes. One of them is a report from The Verge that talks about how Wonder Woman 1984 and Hamilton were arguably two of the most successful films of 2020, if not the biggest films of 2020, even though they were primarily released on streaming services. There's also an article on the show notes under the Netflix section talking about how Netflix movie slate for 2021 is going to be the largest it's ever been. And part of that has to do with, obviously, as they continue to ramp up production on more content as they have been for the last multiple years. The other part of it is that they're also purchasing more films from the studios that aren't playing them in theaters. And on top of that, they've seen success, very much so, when it comes to movies on their services. Just last month, one of the unexpected top projects for the month was a movie called The Midnight Sky, which was directed by George Clooney and also starred him. I personally watched that movie. I thought it was really good, and it was something that I would probably not, in a typical situation, I would not go to a theater to see it. I would probably wait until it comes out, and then I would rent it. But if it's on Netflix, I am more inclined to check it out when it's on streaming, as I think a lot of other people are, because a lot of these films that Netflix has been releasing over the past year have had insanely great numbers. And if you took the numbers that they say that are watching them, 50, 70 million people are watching these films, and you just put it in perspective of how much money those films would be making if they were actually in a theater, it would be extremely successful. But these aren't even films that are costing anywhere near the amount of money that some of the films that make, over $1 billion in the box office are making. So Netflix, they're touting that every single week they're going to be releasing at least one new movie. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's always going to be a high-profile blockbuster, but they will be releasing a film, which means you're going to see more films from the international markets being marketed as part of this. But they have 70 films as of right now. Chances are that number is actually going to increase as 2021 progresses, and they're going to have a lot of films.
I mean, it's a weird time. 2020, 2021, potentially 2022. Films usually meant for the theatrical release. You have an experience that usually happens at the theaters, especially for the bigger blockbuster ones. But you've had to do something different. You had to do something new. This is just the way how it's going to be, is that they are going to release films, pretty often. I really admire HBO Max just kind of leading the charge. You've seen some other companies just release one off or two off, but really HBO Max committing, for the whole entire year that they're definitely going to release their big budget slate onto the streaming service as well. It's concurrently, but it's still the same thing. And yeah, Netflix might be releasing movies every single week, but I feel like, Netflix makes good movies, but in terms of the number of hits that HBO Max was going to release, Warner Media was going to release with like Dune, Wonder Woman 84, include that into the 2021 slate, the Godzilla movie that's out there, and a few others. That's just huge. Movies are a thing. People do like the movies. People watch a lot of, I've watched a couple movies, this past week on the streaming services. And I know that we talk about, especially as the beginning of the show talked about, how important, TV shows are, because you can get back, get an audience back, every single week for, maybe 8, 10, 13 episodes. And you can really get people hooked on the streaming service. In movies, you can't really necessarily do that. You need that steady, flow of content also with, release of these big budget movies. And I think that we've seen that with, the rest of this article was talking about, it's really hard to compare an apples to apples comparison between Wonder Woman 84 and Hamilton. But they talked about, the Verge article sort of analyzed how Hamilton, it was huge, right? I think it was a huge hit, but they realized that there was a significant number of people who, once they signed up for Hamilton, did not renew after that first month. They canceled their service. And I think that kind of goes to show, if you look at Disney Plus, the amount of content that they had, that they were not able to, support a big budget movie. They were able to support it financially, but in terms of content wise, they're not able to support a big budget movie with other content as well, because The Mandalorian wasn't out then. You don't have the new Marvel shows out then. It was just kind of like, hey, let's drop Hamilton. Let's not change anything about the service, and let's just walk away. Well, of course, you're not going to get people around for the longest time, because you're not, releasing new content either through TV shows, you don't have expansive backlog, or you're not releasing other movies throughout the year. And I think, once again, it's a little bit too early to see about, HBO Max's, return on investment with Wonder Woman 84 and how many subscribers they're going to keep. But I think intuition is going to say, I think my intuition says that it's going to be a significantly more percentage of people keeping their HBO Max subscriptions, because HBO Max has a great, catalog of stuff that can keep them involved. But if you even just go on the allure of dropping, movies all the time, HBO Max they are going to release every single month, or about every 2 months, these big hits of films. And so it entices people to keep their subscription service going even more. So I feel like as we shift this conversation I feel like 2020 has shifted this conversation of how people consume, movies nowadays, instead of the theatrical release due to the pandemic and people staying at home, releasing them on the streaming services. What's the best way for the audience? Which is the best way for the streaming companies? And how do you work out everything with the actors and the directors in terms of compensation? I think we started to see this new trend of, okay, we're going to drop these movies, and movies are important, but we need to have the steady flow of content, like HBO Max with every month, every other month, and then Netflix committing, every single week, dropping a big or quote unquote big film, not just like an indie film, but something that they're touting as substantive. Like, I think that's just how the world is going, and that's how you have to organize your upcoming slate as a streaming service. Of, okay, we can't do everything at once. We can't just drop a big hit and just let's see what happens. You have to keep feeding the streaming service. You have to keep dropping big things consecutively throughout time. That's just the way the world is.
Ultimately, as we've talked about before, these big films and the big projects, they're always going to do a great job of bringing people in, but it's a matter of whether or not you have content, like you said earlier, whether or not you have content to keep people around. Hamilton is not that type of project. Was not the type of project that's going to appeal generally to the Disney audience. It's not something that would necessarily, you would say, oh, I know, I have Disney Plus, I'm definitely going to check this out. Typically, the people who had Disney Plus are people with kids or are looking for more family content. And Hamilton, it's great content, but it's not necessarily the same type of content that Disney Plus was delivering with their back catalog that they offer on the service itself. So it's a perfect example of that. When you look at a service like HBO Max, they're trying to do, very similar to with what Netflix has, which is have content for kids, have content for adults, have content for different demographics of adults, whether it be males, females, whether it be older or younger. They're trying to make sure that they have content for everyone. Disney Plus skews much more younger and much just more family oriented. So Hamilton, while people want to check that project out, it's a question of will they continue to stick around afterwards, knowing that this isn't content that they would typically be subscribing to in the first place. Wonder Woman 1984 is a great example of bringing people into a service, and then once they see what else is in HBO Max, they'll stick around. And obviously, I'm a proponent of HBO Max. I like the service. I've given it high remarks. If the user interface was a little bit better, that's about one of the few things. But when it comes to their library, they have such a great library of content, and they can only add, they have other content out there that's licensed that will eventually come back to them. And I honestly believe that they have a great library, just as great as Disney, in my opinion. The difference is Disney has a content library that appeals to a much younger audience, and because that content appeals to a much younger audience who has no problem watching it over and over again, it works better for them. HBO Max and Warner Media, they have a great content library too. It's just a matter of making sure that they utilize that content library and continue to expand. And I honestly believe that the movies are a great way to do that. And Netflix treats their films as if they are a marketing tool for the service. That is what they do. They spend an enormous amount of money on some of these films that they might get people to sign up for, but it's very rarely that they're signing up. It's just that they're not leaving the service because there are other content.
Yeah, the marketing for Extraction, the marketing for Extraction, that title, they put a huge amount of money into that marketing budget because the Extraction ads and trailers were just everywhere that I looked on, just, cable television, YouTube TV, just online, just seeing ads for Extraction. So I just want to reaffirm your point of, yes, Netflix really, cares about these movies in terms of like a marketing, PR standpoint, but they're not so beholden to them in terms of like keeping subscribers and making sure their churn rate doesn't drop and whatnot.
Yeah, the one thing that it will do for them is as time progresses and they release more and more movies, it will slowly build up a significant library of content for them, which is part of the other thing that they need to do, because as time progresses and they have less content that they can license from elsewhere, it also presents a problem where they need to have more content for themselves. TV shows are great, but TV shows are very, very specifically marketed to a very specific demographic, and that presents a problem. Movies can be marketed to a much larger demographic. So because of that, and they don't require the necessity of necessarily the time commitment that, a TV show will. When you look at Netflix, they have absolutely zero problem marketing their films. When it comes to their shows, they pick and choose which they market and how much marketing they actually do. But when it comes to their movies, they do a very, very good job of doing it. And you can tell that they have no problem paying whatever they're paying, because they're also starting to get a lot of high-profile directors, high-profile actors to come in and do projects with them as well, because they're just looking at it as a paycheck. They're not concerned about whether or not it's going to be in theaters or on streaming. They're looking as, this is a project, it's going to be seen by a lot of people, and will only bolster their star credibility. And that's a big deal. So I think that films are very important to a service, but films are a very marketable tool to get people to understand what else the service can offer. When it comes to Netflix, there's very few people in the US that probably don't have Netflix that would actually want to have Netflix, that a film is going to draw somebody in. But it will keep people from unsubscribing if they do have a consistent reputation of having good films or enjoyable films. They don't even have to be good. They just need to be enjoyable, because we all know that they release an insane amount of ridiculous Christmas movies every year, just like Hallmark, and that's just the reputation they get, and people still watch them. So that's the thing. I think that films are a great way to market it and to make your streaming service have a bigger library over time, but also bring people in and keep people from leaving. And I think that's the purpose that they serve at this point in time.
I completely agree. And as we have a few more minutes, I have one question for you, Dustin, and I was just thinking about how we keep talking about how important movies are for streaming services, and how you're seeing, different streaming services for their theatrical releases, dumping them on the different streaming services that they have. Do you think, we've heard a lot of complaints from directors of saying, okay, like this was meant for theatrical release, we don't want it to be released through streaming services and whatnot. Do you think that given 2020, given 2021, that's going to happen, and just things changing, perception of streaming services are probably going to change? Do you expect to see like bigger, named directors really embrace this concept of this dual, distribution approach of the same day releasing it as a theatrical and also as a streaming service?
That's a good question. I think that when you look at some high-profile directors, I think there's already ones that have absolutely no problem with either one. There's ones that are very hell-bent on, they want their movies to be seen in theaters. There's some that have no problem whether or not their project that they're currently working on ends up in theaters or whether it ends up on a streaming service. That's clearly out there. When it comes to the divide about whether or not something can be on streaming and theaters at the same time, that presents an interesting take because that's not something that's super common. Nobody's really doing that outside of occasionally Netflix will release something, but that's not very frequently, and it's normally only in a very limited release. HBO Max at this immediate point is the only one who's doing the concurrent releasing. I think that more directors will realize that streaming is here to stay, just like television has adapted over the past 10 years, and there are shows that are made for a longer format that work way better in a binge format that were not necessarily looked at the same way 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I think that the television industry has adapted and realized that streaming is a big deal and there's a lot of possibilities. And I think the movie industry is just kind of getting into that acknowledgement. Like I said, there are directors who have jumped over streaming, who have done stuff with streaming, who have no problem going back to, just a theatrical or working with a larger studio. But there's also some directors who work hand in hand with Netflix, with, Warner Media or with Disney. They don't have a problem with it. I think that when it comes to the main voice behind a film and the issues with it being released in theaters or on a streaming service, it almost always comes down to the director. And the director is always going to be the one who's going to be upset one way or the other if it's not what he thought it was going to be. And I think there's that level of shock, but I think that shock is going to wear off because while everyone anticipates that everything is going to get better, we've talked about this before, things might not get better as fast as everyone is hoping. And if that happens, it presents a lot of problems for the industry as a whole. You can't just stop making films or stop making television shows for the next year because you have such a backlog of content that just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And I think that come the middle of this year, we're going to have a different discussion about, okay, so now if things haven't gotten better, now what are the streaming, how are the media companies reacting? Is Disney going to start shifting things to Disney Plus? Because can you really go 2 years without having any Marvel films release? I don't know that they can because they have so many other films that are already in the works that were also supposed to correspond with some of the releases that they already have planned and filmed and are releasing on Disney Plus. And I think it's only a matter of time that more directors start realizing right now the shock is this is what needs to happen because COVID is happening and this is the reality. In the future, I think the reality is that they're going to realize this is something that people are not going to bounce back from. And not everybody's going to immediately bounce back and say, let's go to the theaters. And even if they are able to, the entire world gets completely vaccinated and we don't have to worry about this exact situation. Are you telling me that for over a year, people sat in their homes and watched streaming services and got accustomed to being able to have a small fee per month to be able to watch a ton of content, and they've gotten accustomed to that, and suddenly they're going to decide to spend that exact same amount of money for one movie ticket for one film? No, it's not going to happen. I think the entire industry is shifting, and I think a lot of people are going to start realizing that, or at least that shock is going to start wearing off here very shortly.
I could not have said that better. Yeah, I was just kind of curious on this is going to become the new normal. Once, the audience, once users get used to something, it's really hard for them to change. It's getting that initial, that initial momentum going. And I don't see, this past year, probably year and a half, 2 years, you're going to see people not go to theaters. It's going to be really hard to get people back into the theaters given, one could say luxury, or one could say just these streaming services just changing, the direction. And I don't see that it's really going to go back to the way it used to be. Now, I'm not saying that things won't change and how there won't be a bigger push for theatrical releases, but this is the new normal. And I don't see, what I'm saying is I'm seeing companies just starting to accept this, that, okay, this is the way that theatrical, releases will move for the future. And this is the future of the movie industry. This relationship between streaming and then also theatrical all at the same time.
All right. So with that being said, that is going to round up this episode. Please check out the show notes. We have all the articles that have posted over the past week. Obviously, we talked about some, and there's a bunch that we didn't talk about. There's also a list of trailers that have released over the past week as well for all the variety of different streaming services. You can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord for all these articles that we talk about here on the podcast, as well as the ones that we don't. You can follow us on Instagram for all latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast posting. You can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, or any topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, please take the time to leave a review or leave feedback in general, or you can send us feedback through our email. We're always looking forward to hearing from our listeners, and we greatly appreciate your support in that. With all of that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.